Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show, as most of you know, that brings you the uncompromising libertarian perspective and analysis on the burning issues of the day and what's going on in the world. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host and uncompromising libertarian, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to be back here with our viewers and listeners, and you as well.
Yeah, I thought we would talk about a subject that we often hear a lot about, both in the political world and the educational world, and that's the concept of democracy. I mean, we see, U.S. interventions abroad to spread democracy. We saw World War I that was supposedly designed to make the world safe for democracy. And I thought what we would do is analyze that concept, but compare it to the free market, because you often hear the concepts in the same breath, where people will say, oh, well, the U.S. troops are going abroad to spread democracy and capitalism. And so I thought it's important to break down these concepts. And so I thought, well, why don't we talk about this during the Libertarian Angle? And so let me begin by just talking a little bit about democracy, and then I'll turn it over to you. That, democracy is really a political system, while capitalism or the free market, laissez-faire, is an economic system. And that's an important distinction, that a democratic political system is simply one in which people are putting people into public office through electoral means. That is, that they're electing their president or the members of their legislature, as compared to just a dictatorship where the person doesn't stand for elections. He just assumes power and says, I'm now in charge. But that concept of a democracy versus a dictatorship doesn't necessarily say anything about the type of economic system that exists in that country. So what do you think, Richard?
Well, I think that what has to realize is that, on the one hand, the concept of modern democracy, of course, democracy goes back to the ancient Greeks in Athens, for instance. But the concept of modern democracy is that rather than having the absolute monarch, as was historically the case in which you alluded to, the dictator, government should be responsible to and reflect the wishes of those over whom the government is ruling. The absolute monarch could be arbitrary. He could die and he could be superseded by a son who is mentally deranged. Or, of course, by luck and chance of fate, you could have a benevolent monarch who, in some sincere way, according to his own lights, tries to do the best for, quote, his people. But the general belief is that government increasingly should be viewed as an institution that reflects a protection of the rights of the citizenship and reflects their wishes and desires and the direction of the government over which that is above them. So as a consequence, it's not surprising that the emergence of modern democracy in, let's say, the 1700s and into the 1800s was identified with freedom. Certainly, if people elect their representatives based upon representatives running for public office on a various platform, and the people have selected them, and they then are in office and are expected to abide by their election promises because they're always up for re-election at some stipulated time, at which the voters could reject them if they have failed to follow the voters' wishes, that this, in a sense, represents a degree of freedom. Now, certainly, as you were saying, compared to a dictatorship, it is far superior to that. But one has to understand that, as you also were suggesting, democracy is basically an institutional mechanism for selecting those who will hold political office during a designated period of time. It in no way says what is it that government will do. Will it recognize and respect individual rights and private property in a free enterprise system? Will it nationalize means of production, regulate various corners of the remaining private sector, redistribute wealth among the various subgroups of the society? That is not explained, identified, or determined by democracy itself. What government does, how the representatives will use the power that the people give them through an election, depends upon the political philosophy that is guiding both the voters and those who then hold public office. And that can be a variety of them. Now, the difference with the free market is that the market is based upon a set of essential and prerequisite institutions, a respect for the individual rights of individuals to make their own choices and decisions, to freely associate with their neighbors, whether those neighbors are close or far away in another part of the world, based upon mutual agreement and voluntary exchange, that there be an impartial and unbiased rule of law that respects and secures those rights, among which is the right to private property that has been honestly acquired, that is, through methods that do not involve violence or fraud. Representatives who are elected, because that is the spirit of the citizenry, who then enforce such laws of respect for rights rather than their violation, is a democratic system that therefore reflects the spirit of liberty in the society. But by itself, unless that is the climate of ideas at the time, the political and ideological expression that is conveyed through the election by the electorate to those who are elected, there is no guarantee that freedom will be secured. Now, institutionally, if I can continue with this for a minute or two, there's important differences between the market and the democratic process. It is often made that there's a parallel. Do we not, as individuals, make our choices in society? And in the democratic process, we collectively make our choices in society. But there's important differences in the following way I would suggest. First of all, in the market, our choices are individual. In the political arena, they are group or collective. By which I mean is you go into the supermarket and you go down the aisles with your shopping cart and you pull off one item off the shelf, another item off the shelf, 2 of this, 4 of that, 3 of something, none of another. And then you go to the checkout counter. And if you look around to the left and the right and you look at the other people in the other rows of the checkout counters or the people in front of you or behind you, you'll notice that in some cases, what they put in their baskets are similar to what you've put in. But in other cases, other goods are there that you haven't bought and vice versa, or at the minimum, the different quantities. The quantities are different. And you just buy what you want, you pay for your purchases, and you leave, and you can then enjoy those goods and services and value items that reflect your taste, preferences, beliefs, meanings, and desires of life, in no way impinging upon or requiring others to conform to what you have or you conforming to them. The difference in the political arena is that what gets out at the shopping cart, what gets in the shopping cart and what goes through the checkout stand of the political process is not individualistic. I can't get anything that I want other than persuading enough other citizens to want the same political policy items in our political shopping cart that I desire. The result might be that I then go through the shopping cart of the election and then have to live for a period of time with policies focusing on having the government do X, Y, and Z that I might not agree with, or different proportions or relevant degrees of. The other element of it, I can change my time, my tastes and preferences and desires anytime I want. The fact that I went to the supermarket and put these things in my cart today does not tie me to doing the same thing tomorrow or next week or next month. I can change what I want to consume and the relative amounts of what I want to consume, and I then buy it out individually at the checkout counter again. The problem with the political arena is that once the choice has been made, whether I agree with what the majority has voted to have implemented or not, I cannot try to change what the government does through election of either the same or different representatives, other than the discrete individual periods of election. In other words, I can't go back the next day and say, change that redistributive policy or end it completely. I have to then wait for the next election. As a result, is that my choices are constrained not only to what others want, and I can get them to agree with or I must conform to, but I have to wait periodically for the occasional election to arise. Then there's the other element of this, that elections are, whether they're in a parliamentary system or our electoral system in the United States, remain the fact that in one sense it's a winner take all. If I have voted, let's say, Republican and the Democrat gets elected, or vice versa, or I voted for a third party such as the Libertarian or the Vegetarian Party, I'm stuck with what the majority have agreed to in the election process. Even in a proportional parliamentary system, if the party and the policies I wanted are a small minority, my party's representatives may not make it into the parliament, or represent such a small minority that they can't influence anything. So again, this requires a collective choice, a collective restriction of individual decision making, with occasional and periodic changing of personalities and policies that have nothing to do with our changing values and preferences. So we're not assured that democracy will preserve liberty. It could violate it. We cannot make our individual choices as we can in the marketplace with our buying and selling. And we can't have the discretion and the latitude to change our preferences, values, and choices in a rather wide arena of discrete moments. In the political arena, it's periodic based upon the laws of how often elections occur. And therefore, they are parallel or have similarities, but they are not the same thing. And then one other element, I know I'm talking too long, Jacob, but when the Founding Fathers advocated the idea of a new America that would be grounded in the concept of self-government, they certainly meant a Republican form of representation, in which the citizens would elect the representatives to hold office reflecting their choices and values. But the more important notion of self-government, in my estimation, is that when they spoke to self-government and said, government is there to protect people's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness and private property, is that the true self-government is the self-government of the individual. As long as he acts peacefully and non-violently and non-fraudulently, to be self-governing as to what he does, when he does it, why he does it, and with whom he voluntarily associates to achieve mutually agreed upon ends. That is the ultimate self-government. To the extent that a democracy exists, it is an institutional mechanism to reflect what people want, but needs to be guided socially, culturally, by a philosophy and attitude of liberty, without which democracy can destroy freedom rather than be a guardian of it.
Yeah, I find it interesting that U.S. officials spend so much time extolling the virtues of democracy or condemning countries that are not democracies and invading countries to establish democracies. When in fact, if you look around you, democracy really doesn't guarantee very much. I mean, if the best that democracy produces is the likes of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, that's not really a walking advertisement for, hey, why other countries should adopt a democratic system. And if you look at the Constitution, which is the document that called the federal government into existence, the word democracy isn't even mentioned in there. People don't say, the framers didn't say, hey, look, our goal is to establish a democracy. Their goal was to establish a free society. And as you point out, they understood that democracy can be a grave threat to freedom. In fact, if you look at the First Amendment, school children are often taught, and even college students are taught, that the First Amendment gives people freedom of speech. Well, it doesn't do that. It doesn't give any rights. That our ancestors understood that rights don't come from government. They don't come from the Constitution. And that's why the First Amendment is phrased very carefully. It doesn't say people have a right to freedom of speech. It says Congress shall pass no law which abridges freedom of speech. So what they're essentially saying is Congress will not interfere with this pre-existing natural God-given right. Well, what is Congress? Congress is the elected representatives of the people, the democratic will, where people go and vote and they put people into office. So here our ancestors are saying, this democratic body will not have the power to abridge our speech, which implies that they are a grave threat to freedom of speech. Democracy is. And so, as you point out, Richard, a democratic system not only isn't a guarantee of freedom, in many times it becomes a threat to freedom. And so people have to figure out, well, okay, what is the advantage of a democratic system? Because theoretically, you could have a non-elected dictator that says, I guarantee you I'm not going to infringe on freedom of speech. I'm going to let you have free markets. I'm not going to tax you very much. And so you could theoretically have a political dictatorship in which people are freer in their daily lives than an elected dictatorship, which is putting people into jail for criticizing the government or taxing them 90% and so forth. So I think Mises put it best, Ludwig von Mises, when he says the only real advantage of a democratic system is that it enables people to change their ruling regime peacefully. That is to say, as ideas shift and people want a change in the government, if they're unelected, the only way to do that is through a violent revolution, which entails death and destruction. With a democratic system, you can peacefully, evict people in public office and bring in new ideas and new philosophies and new candidates. But that's really the only advantage. It's no guarantee of liberty. All right, so and obviously people exercise their democratic vote sometimes in ways that many of us consider, is not very good, very sound. They elect so-called bad people to public office. And even the government believes this, the federal government. I mean, think about Chile or Guatemala or Iran in the 1950s through the 1970s. They elected, people that the U.S. felt were unsavory people. Like in Chile, there was Salvador Allende, where they democratically elected a socialist. So here you're using a political system, a democratic system, to elect a guy that's going to establish a socialist economic system, which, as you and I know, is contrary to the principles of economic liberty. Same in Guatemala, where people elected in a very legitimate election, Jacobo Arbenz. Same in Iran in prior to 53, where the Iranian people, through their parliament, elected or appointed Mohammad Mossadegh to be the prime minister. The CIA, the national security establishment, goes in and ousts all of them because they say that these democratic results were a threat to U.S. national security. So really what people have to figure out is, number one, what is it that makes a free society? And as you and I pointing out, just because you can democratically elect your rulers doesn't make that a free society. That ultimately what makes that free society is limitations on the powers of those who are elected. And that's where a constitution comes into play. And hopefully an independent judicial system that enforces those constitutional restraints. So then you end up with a system, essentially the Bill of Rights, you end up with a system where people are democratically elected, but where there are limitations on their powers, that they can't abridge freedom of speech, even if they're democratically elected by 99% of the people. They can't force people to go to church. And from the economic liberty standpoint, they cannot interfere with people's peaceful economic activities. And so once people figure that out, and a lot of times it's trial and error, in these countries, for example, that elect socialists, I consider it totally illegitimate that the U.S. goes in and invades, and in all of these three instances I mentioned, they install military dictators. I mean, in one, like Pinochet in Chile, they even said, well, he's going to bring free market philosophy, the Chicago boys, Milton Friedman. And so they justified by saying, well, okay, he was unelected, but let's talk about the really good stuff he did in terms of economics. Well, of course, it wasn't really a free market system. You had all these Chicago boys assuming government positions. Now, they lowered regulations and lowered taxes. Sort of like Margaret Thatcher's type of freedom. But it wasn't genuine freedom. As a libertarian would say, genuine freedom is abolish the departments and agencies that are interfering with political, economic activity. And so the people have to learn this through trial and error oftentimes. And that's where we libertarians come in and say, look, the real solution to this is maintain a democratic system to provide a peaceful means of changing people in office, but limit their powers. Separate economy and the state. Separate church and state. Separate education in the state. So that whoever is elected, he doesn't have the power to do bad things to people or good things for people.
Yeah, this whole problem arose because of a transformative confusion about things that began also in the 1700s, the same time of the American Revolution. It was manifested in the French Revolution that followed several years later, and particularly as captured in the ideas of the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I say this because if you think of the American Revolution, it had all the characteristics that you were just saying. Fear and anger about an arbitrary and an abusive king and a parliament that was taken to reflect his policies. And the idea that government should not abuse the rights of the people. You need a representative mechanism, but that government has to be restricted within the narrow confines of a constitution that says Congress may pass no law. The government may not abridge people's liberties in this way, with this notion that somehow liberties precede government, the liberties do not come from government. This changed with the French Revolution and has influenced ideas ever since. Because with the French Revolution came the idea that of this Rousseau's idea of the general will. Individuals may err, but the people, the collective, always knows what's right. And if the people elect the representatives, and therefore the representatives reflect the will of the people as a whole, then anything that those representatives do in the name of the people has to be viewed as an expression of freedom, the free expression of the people in having elected them and desired these policies. Because how can a person enslave or harm himself in his actions? If I decide to do something, it reflects my desires, wishes, and belief systems. I've not forced anything on myself. Well, if there's the collective will of the society as a whole, and this is a collective expression of the will of the people, then it cannot be oppressive, but can only be a liberating reflection of their desire and therefore their freedom. Now, this has meant that democracy, rather than a narrow mechanism of electing officials periodically, who then are restrained by a constitution to secure people's rights to life, liberty, property, freedom of speech, etc., is now viewed as an agency, a mechanism through which that whatever the people want, in a majoritarian sense, or coalitions of special interest groups who make up a majority on election day, can now impose anything they want, any regulations. It represents the will and desires of the people. Any redistribution of wealth, it represents the will and desires of the people. Any foreign intervention represents the will and the desire of the people. And this idea that democracy is freedom, rather than democracy as a mechanism to secure freedom outside of and prior to and independent of government, has caused this immense confusion and the situation we often find ourselves in. And this is frustrating for many people. Let's take the American invasion of Iraq. We overthrow Saddam Hussein, no doubt a tyrant who is brutal, cruel to both any individual opponent and to segments of the society who seemed rebellious against him. So we overthrow Saddam Hussein during the Bush administration, guided by an internationalist neoconservative philosophy of spreading democracy. And then what happens? We're aghast. We're shocked. Because then, after a period of time, they start holding these elections. And what happens? Well, women are not allowed to vote, or women are not allowed to be representatives in the parliament. Various religious or ethnic groups are oppressed because the majority doesn't want them to have the same liberties or privileges or rights as themselves. And then Americans in the policy arena and outside are shocked. Shocked, how could this happen? It's democracy. Because the electoral mechanism does not say what result will come through that mechanism. That, as you were saying, and I was saying earlier, requires a prior political philosophy, an ideology of social relationships that is either based in individual liberty, classical liberalism, libertarianism, or some form of collectivism and socialism. You had mentioned the examples of socialist governments that have been elected democratically. Well, the most prominent one right at the end of the Second World War was what? Clement Attlee and the Labour Party in Great Britain. In fact, in the midst of the war, in the sense that Germany had surrendered, but Japan was still fighting. And there, at the Potsdam Conference in 1945 in the summer, is Winston Churchill, Harry Truman, because Roosevelt had died, and Joseph Stalin. And in the middle of their conference, the election is held in Britain, and Clement Attlee takes the place of Winston Churchill. And what is Clement Attlee? The head of the Labour Party, who then proceeds to nationalize industries and oppose the national healthcare system. So having a democratic system does not protect you from misguided, wrong, and dangerous policies limiting liberty upon the people.
Yeah, your example of Iraq is very good, because I mean, the framers tried to protect us against a president, a ruler, who just goes to war on his own initiative. I mean, they said, okay, we're going to have divided government here. So they have a democratic system, but with limits on the power of the Congress and the rest of the federal government. You can't abridge freedom of speech, freedom of religion. But at the same token, we understand that the propensity of presidents and rulers and dictators to take nations into war, so we're going to separate the war power here, so that only Congress decides whether we're going to go to war. And once Congress makes that determination, if it does, then it will be the president's job to wage the war. Mm-hmm. Well, Bush doesn't do that. He just says, no, I am now assuming the power to declare war. He goes to war, and there was protests against going, but only in the sense of this is not a good idea. But nobody, or hardly anybody, libertarians, of course, raise the notion is, you don't have the legal authority to do this under our form of government. And then we also should keep in mind that in the 80s, Saddam Hussein was a partner and ally of the U.S. government. When they were over there saying, well, we want to kill Iranians, and he was their proxy to kill Iranians, because Iranians had ousted the Shah, which the CIA had installed in 1953, and so the U.S. Government was very angry about that, so they were supporting Saddam as he was killing Iranians. And so there's this mindset of deference to authority that oftentimes comes into existence in both democratic and totalitarian countries, that they know best. Whatever they do, if they love Saddam, we will love Saddam. If they don't like Saddam, we won't like Saddam. And let me also mention the idea of mandatory charity. I mean, here you have a government, primarily since the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, that says we will have the authority to force you to be good, to be caring. I mean, the country was founded on the principle of you decide for yourself whether to care for the needy, seniors, elderly, those in need. That charity was voluntary. So there was no income tax. You kept everything you earned. You decide what to do with your money. It was this concept of freedom of choice when it comes to charity. That all goes out the window with the adoption of the welfare state way of life. Now we're forced through this democratic structure to care for the seniors, our parents, through Social Security or Medicare, or others through farm subsidies, aid to dictatorships, on and on and on. What we libertarians say is, look, how you exercise freedom of speech is no different in terms of what you do with your own money. The values are the same. That just as you should be free to decide what to say and what to read and who to worship or whatever, you should be free to do what you want with your own money. But here's a classic example of where the democracy, the democratic government, has abridged people's freedom of speech, freedom of will when it comes to charity.
Yeah, the other element of this is that we take for granted, as you were saying, this idea that whatever the government does must be legitimate, because we assume that since it is there representing us, it can do no wrong. A perfect example of this in modern times has to do with national security surveillance. The idea that the CIA, the FBI, the National Security Agency, and all of their subdivisions and related bureaus and branches can basically have the authority to look into anything that we're saying, anything that we're writing, especially in transmitted through electronic form, that they can sort of capture through electronic means of one type or another. And all of this that violates our notion of privacy, the traditional notions of search warrants and justifiability of intrusion into people's papers and property is all out the window because, well, it's to protect us. And how do we know that it's to protect us? Well, the representatives from the president down said it is necessary. And did we not elect them? Are they not a voice of us to give us what we want? Therefore, anything that they do to us, including the most intimate intrusion into our personal lives, is a reflection of what we want them to do. You hear this in a phrase that was very common in the Vietnam War that I don't hear quite as much, but there's a similar sentiment today. Well, if you don't love it, leave it. The idea is that, well, it's a free country and you can leave any time. So, in other words, if I have honestly bought a home and I honestly maintain it with money that I have earned in free exchange, now my neighbors decide to throw rocks in my window at my window, or to plunder pieces of furniture in my living room and my bedroom, and I say these are violations of my rights. Well, you live in this society, love it or leave it. No. The presumption is that I don't have to leave because others choose to violate my rights. The right response is they should no longer have the discretion to plunder that which I have honestly earned or anything I wish to peacefully do. The onus is on them and not me, that if I don't like their plunder and privilege, that I have to leave. No, I have a right to be here if I've done it so through these honest means that I mentioned. It is called upon for them to cease and desist the violations of my liberty.
Yeah, you bring up a great point when you say, look, the national security estate, the NSA, the CIA, the great big military-industrial complex, foreign military bases, and permanent military, that this is all done by Democratic vote. I mean, Congress authorized this. They called the NSA into existence in 53. They called the CIA into existence in 47. The same thing with the welfare state, that the New Deal was adopted by Congress, is enacted into law. But what everybody forgets here is that the Constitution is what calls the government into existence. And it set up a particular structure. It was a system. And it was provided that if you ever want to change this system, you have to amend the structure. You have to amend the Constitution, which they made very difficult to do. You got to go through, 2/3 of the state legislatures approving it and so forth. I mean, we saw an example of that with prohibition. I mean, imagine, they wanted to make it illegal for people to drink booze. They couldn't just pass a law making it illegal. That was not constitutional. They had to go through the whole amendment process to make it illegal. Well, that was what was required, Richard, when they converted America, the federal government, to a welfare state. They were fundamentally altering the structure of government. Same with the national security state. That's a totalitarian type of structure. A national security establishment, NSA, surveillance, CIA, assassinations, torture, big military. Those are all inherent to totalitarian regimes. They needed to go the constitutional amendment process. So that's the higher law that says, no, that people are free in this society, and if you're going to change the structure to deprive them of their freedom, which a national security establishment does, which a welfare state does, you need to go through an amendment process to get approval from, 2/3 of the people through 2/3 of the state legislatures or not. And I think that's an important point to emphasize here, that the structure was designed to protect the exercise of fundamental pre-existing rights, and if you wanted to alter that, you had to go through this difficult process to get there.
Yes, all of this is reflected in the slow progressions of an attitude that the Constitution is not there to protect freedom. This emerging idea since the late 19th, beginning of the 20th century, that these constitutional restraints are hampering democracy and the freedom of choice that people want to reflect through the democratic process. Woodrow Wilson, who was president, elected in 1912, had been a professor of political science before that, among places, Princeton. He's famous for several books. One is called The State. And in this book, he says that the Constitution is an archaic and out-of-date impediment on government being able to reflect the wills and needs of the people in wider centralized discretion and power. That germ of that idea is what has resulted in the implementation of these welfare programs. Roosevelt guiding America into the Second World War unconstitutionally and in violation of neutrality acts that he himself had signed off on, that Congress had passed, because there's a greater good that those in power know it represents the will of the people, and they reflect it because they have been elected to that office. They haven't gotten there by violence, and therefore now they have a vision of what the people should have and need that who have put them in office, even if all of those people who elected them do not clearly understand where they should want to go if they were enlightened as the elected leaders. Now, you carry this through. This is the situation today. By what right does the government redistribute wealth? By what right does it undertake wars of intervention and aggression? By what right does it pick winners and losers and influence the outcomes, political outcomes of other countries? All of this hullabaloo about the Russians interfered with the 26th election, why they might have tipped the scales in favor of Donald Trump. Now, if they intervened and interfered or tried to, what else is new in the world? Because what is the entire history of the United States government in foreign affairs since the end of the Second World War, if not in many ways, shapes, and forms, doing that? As you said, overthrowing governments, clandestinely providing money to parties to run an election, to subsidize anti-Soviet publications. One of the leading intellectual magazines in Europe in the 1950s and into the 60s, even the 70s, I think, was a magazine called Encounter Magazine. It actually came out monthly. It had great articles by major named people. But this was all meant to be an intellectual thrust against Soviet socialist and communist ideas. And it was heavily funded through various circuitous routes by the CIA. The idea is influencing the climate of opinion, influencing electoral outcomes, overthrowing governments. Well, is that not trying to interfere with an electoral process? Give me a break. The hypocrisy, the self-righteous arrogance of these people. And who's claiming the most about this? These Democrats. Well, that's what Obama was doing for 8 years in various parts of the world, just as Bush had been doing it before that for 8 years before Obama. And you can go backwards. This blood is on all of their hands. Oh, my hands are clean. It's the other fellow. I'm shocked. This is the climate of international politics today, and has been for over 70 years, where the U.S. arrogantly believes it can affect and influence the direction and the content of what governments do, what people want and are stuck with. But the Russians, they might have bought some ads on Facebook. Oh, the foundation is shaking. The pillars are falling. Give me a break.
Yeah, it's a real testament to the public schooling system in America that the Russians can put a few ads there and influence everybody to go vote for Trump. But Richard, ultimately, it's not a constitution that protects this freedom. It's really the awareness of people and the vigilance, eternal vigilance, and how bad people want to be free. That we've often said that no constitution, no nicely written paper can protect rights. That ultimately it's up to a critical mass in the citizenry that say, no, you are not crossing that line. You're not going to conduct surveillance on me. I want a free society, not a secure society. I'm not going to give up my freedom for the sake of what you call security. With freedom comes security. But that ultimately can only come about through this awareness and understanding of what a free society really is, and a willingness to stand up against the government and say, no, you're not going to take away my freedom in the supposed effort to keep me safe.
Yet at the most, democracy, which obviously is far better than an absolute monarch or a dictator per se, can only serve as a means to support and secure liberty. Democracy is in itself not liberty. And that confusion and misunderstanding needs to be clarified. If looking to the future, we are to devise ways of influencing and persuading our fellow citizens that what we need is to get government out of our lives and not further into it.
All right. On that note, we'll wrap it up. Richard, it's always good to talk to you. If you want to learn more about the Future of Freedom Foundation, come to visit us at fff.org. If you're not already subscribing to our FFF Daily, I'd recommend you do it. It's free. We carry a weekly article by Richard every Monday. Libertarian Angle is posted there. My daily blog is posted there. For I guess 15 years, we have strived to make FFF Daily the best libertarian commentary page on the internet. So come over to fff.org and subscribe. And Richard, as always, it was a pleasure. I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in.